I broke into an abandoned cabin. A widow whispered, "My husband's brother wants me out." Callum Reyes had $10, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job repairing track inspection equipment, and a habit of following remote rail spurs to their farthest, most forgotten ends. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of shelter that kept him fed and warm for a few weeks at a time. He was 22 years old, laid off 10 months earlier when the Regional Rail Authority automated its track inspection process and eliminated the walking inspector positions that had, for over a century, kept a human pair of eyes on remote sections of line no sensor network could fully replace. He had been moving through rail towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The automation announcement had come with language about efficiency gains and modernized monitoring, phrases Callum had learned in the 10 months since to recognize as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a walking inspector's actual knowledge of a remote section's particular quirks counted for less than whatever a network of remote sensors could theoretically detect from a distance. He had grown up the son of a track inspector himself, walking sections alongside his father from the age of 10, learning to read a rail bed's condition the way another child might learn to read weather, a skill that had felt, for the 3 years he held his own position, like the natural continuation of everything his father had spent a career teaching him. Losing it had felt less like losing a paycheck than losing the last place that inherited attentiveness still seemed to matter to anyone. He found the cabin at dusk on a cold evening in late autumn, tucked into a stand of pine a half-mile off the rail grade, a small log structure that had clearly once served as a track walker's shelter, built decades earlier for the inspector who patrolled this remote section on foot before any automated system existed to do the job instead. The cabin's door stood slightly ajar, its lock long since broken, and Callum let himself in expecting nothing more than an empty shelter for the night. The cabin's exterior, weathered gray with age, showed the particular soundness of log construction properly maintained, the chinking between logs largely intact except for a few visible gaps near the roofline, the whole structure standing with the quiet sturdiness of something built to outlast whoever built it, provided somebody kept it from being entirely forgotten. He found instead a woman standing near the small hearth, startled by his sudden entrance, her hand pressed instinctively against her chest before she recovered herself enough to speak. "You gave me a fright," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, as though she'd trained herself, out of some recent habit, to keep her voice from carrying beyond these four walls. "I wasn't expecting anyone tonight." "I'm sorry," Callum said. "The door was open. I thought the place was abandoned." He glanced back at the broken latch hanging loose against the frame, understanding even in that first startled moment that the lock's failure had been the only reason he'd found her at all. "It might as well be most days," the woman said. "Name's Fay Merrick. This cabin was my husband's family's, going back 3 generations. Wallace and I lived here the last 6 years of our marriage, until he passed this past spring." She studied Callum a long moment, some private calculation passing behind her tired eyes. "You're not one of Dale's men, are you? Come to see whether I've packed up yet?" "I don't know who Dale is," Callum said. "I don't know anything about any of this, if I'm honest. I just followed the rail grade and found an open door." "Then you're about to learn considerably more than you bargained for tonight," Fay said and gestured him toward the hearth, where a small fire already burned low. "Sit, if you're staying. I could use the company, whatever else tonight turns out to be." Over the following hour, Fay told him, in the same low, careful voice, exactly why a widow was living alone in a remote cabin half a mile from the nearest rail line, whispering even in her own home as though the walls themselves might report her words to someone she'd rather not hear them. Wallace Merrick had inherited the cabin and its surrounding 40 acres jointly with his younger brother Dale upon their father's death 15 years earlier, a joint inheritance neither brother had ever formally divided, since Dale had moved to the city decades before and shown no interest in the property beyond an occasional visit. Wallace and Fay had lived in the cabin exclusively for the final 6 years of their marriage, maintaining it, paying its modest property taxes, and treating it, in every practical sense, as fully their own, an arrangement that had suited everyone until Wallace's sudden death from a heart attack. That past spring left the property's legal status considerably more complicated than either brother had ever bothered clarifying while Wallace was alive. Dale showed up 3 weeks after the funeral, Fay said, with a lawyer's letter informing me he intended to force a partition sale of the property, since he technically still holds an undivided half interest that Wallace never formally bought out. He wants his half in cash, and since I don't have the money to buy him out myself, a partition sale means the whole property gets sold at auction, whether I want to leave or not. Why now, after 15 years of showing no interest at all? Callum asked. I've asked myself that same question every night since the letter arrived, Fay said. I think Wallace's death simply reminded Dale that a piece of paper existed he'd forgotten to formally settle, and grief has a way of making some people grasping rather than generous, particularly when there's money involved that they've convinced themselves they're rightfully owed. I don't know Dale well. Wallace rarely spoke of him, and never with much warmth. Have you had anyone helping you through all this? Callum asked. Neighbors, friends, anyone at all? The nearest neighbor's 4 miles down the grade, and I haven't had the heart to explain the whole situation to anyone since the funeral, Fay admitted. It's easier, in a way, to keep it small and quiet, just between me and whatever letter Dale's lawyer sends next. I think some part of me has been hiding from the whole world these past months, not just from Dale. That sounds like a lonely way to grieve, Callum said. It is, Fay said. I don't recommend it, if you ever find yourself with the choice. But it's the way I know how to do it, at least until something or someone comes along to remind me there's another way available. Is there any record of an agreement between the brothers about the property? Callum asked. Something that might have settled Dale's interest years ago, even informally? If there was, I've never seen it, Fay said. Wallace never spoke much about his brother, beyond mentioning more than once that they'd settled things between them privately not long after their father's death. I always assumed that meant something had been resolved. I don't have proof of it, and Dale's lawyer isn't inclined to simply take my word on the matter. Callum spent the following days doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He looked at what the cabin actually needed, understanding that making himself useful was the only currency he had to offer a woman who had already shared her fire and her trouble with a stranger who'd broken in uninvited. The cabin's chimney had partially collapsed at its cap, letting rain seep into the flue and threatening the whole structure's stability if left unaddressed through another hard winter. And Callum spent 3 days rebuilding the damaged section with stone he gathered from the surrounding property, working carefully to match the original mason's technique, rather than simply patching the damage with whatever came easiest. He mixed the mortar himself from a recipe he remembered his father describing once on a long inspection walk years earlier, understanding that a chimney repaired with the wrong material would simply fail again within a season or two. Undoing the work before winter ever properly tested it. He tested the rebuilt flue's draw carefully over several evenings before trusting it to a full fire, building small test fires and watching how the smoke cleared, adjusting the cap's angle slightly until the draw pulled clean and steady, even in a crosswind, understanding that a chimney that smoked back into the cabin during a hard winter storm could prove considerably more dangerous than the collapsed cap it was meant to replace. He repaired a section of the cabin's roof where age had let shingles work loose, replacing each one by hand and resealing the ridge line where water had begun finding its way beneath the existing shingles. and rebuilt the small woodshed's collapsed wall. Work he did as much out of habit as any real expectation the cabin's ownership would resolve in Faye's favor, regardless of his efforts. He also rechinked several gaps in the cabin's log walls, where old mortar had crumbled away, working methodically around the entire structure over the better part of a week. Understanding that a log cabin's true weatherproofing depended as much on these small, unglamorous joints as on anything more visible. Faye watched him work most afternoons, bringing him coffee and sitting nearby with the particular quiet company of someone who had spent months alone and had nearly forgotten how comfortable another person's presence could be. "Wallace always meant to fix that chimney properly," she told him one afternoon. "Kept saying he'd get to it next season, and next season kept becoming the season after that. I don't think he ever quite believed anything on this property could actually fail him." "Some repairs feel less urgent until the day they aren't," Callum said. "I've learned that the hard way more than once myself." It was in a small, strong box tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's single bedroom, which Faye showed him after several days of growing trust between them, that they found Wallace's own private papers, kept separate from anything Dale's lawyer might have already reviewed through the estate's formal probate process. "I found this box a few weeks after the funeral, going through his things," Faye said, setting it on the kitchen table between them. "I hadn't had the heart to look through it properly until now. It felt like something I wasn't quite ready to disturb." Among the papers was a handwritten letter from Wallace to Dale, dated just over 14 years earlier, along with what appeared to be Dale's own signed reply. The letter described, in Wallace's plain and direct hand, an agreement the brothers had reached shortly after their father's death. Wallace would take sole responsibility for the cabin and its surrounding land, maintaining and paying taxes on the property indefinitely, in exchange for Dale receiving the entirety of their father's remaining cash savings and a small parcel of separate timberland neither brother had mentioned to Faye before. Dale's reply, signed and dated the same month, confirmed his agreement to the arrangement in his own hand, stating plainly that he considered his interest in the cabin property fully settled by the exchange and had no further claim on it going forward. Faye read both letters twice, her hands trembling slightly against the old paper. "Wallace never told me about the timberland," she said. "I don't think he considered it relevant once the arrangement was settled. He wasn't a man who dwelled on old business once he thought it finished." "This is exactly what settles the matter," Callum said, reading the exchange a second time to be certain he understood its full weight. "If this letter's authentic, Dale agreed in writing, 14 years ago, to relinquish his interest in the cabin entirely. Whatever partition claim his lawyers filed now directly contradicts an agreement he signed himself. I need to know this holds up properly, not just in my own reading of it," Faye said. "I don't have money for a proper attorney, Callum. I don't know how to make a 14-year-old letter mean anything to a court that's already scheduled a partition hearing." Callum found, through a call to the county courthouse the following morning, that the partition hearing was scheduled for just 11 days out, considerably sooner than either of them had understood, the legal process having moved forward through the formal probate proceedings, while Faye, unable to afford proper legal counsel, had simply been trying to delay the inevitable rather than actually contest it. 11 days, Faye repeated when Callum told her. "I've been telling myself for weeks that something would come along to stop this, without ever quite believing it myself. I don't know whether to be relieved we finally have a real piece of evidence, or terrified we don't have nearly enough time to make proper use of it." They spent the following days searching for an attorney willing to take the case on terms Faye could actually afford, until a rural legal aid attorney named Foster Cray, whose name Callum recognized from a similar matter a widow 2 counties over had once needed help with, agreed to review the letter and take the case pro bono once he understood the strength of the evidence involved. Cray's office, tucked above the county courthouse, held the particular organized clutter of a man who took on more cases than his small practice could easily manage, out of a stubborn commitment to representing people who had nowhere else to turn. He read both letters twice, comparing the handwriting against nothing more than his own trained eye at first, before setting them down with an expression Fay had learned over the past week to recognize as cautious optimism. A stack of other case files sat precariously on the corner of his desk, evidence of a practice stretched thin across more clients than any single attorney could properly serve, and Fay found herself grateful, watching him give her own case his full, unhurried attention regardless, that such men still existed in a profession she'd assumed, before meeting him, was populated mostly by people like Dale's own well-paid counsel. This letter, if authenticated properly, is about as clean a settlement as I've seen in a case like this, Cray told them in his small office above the county courthouse. Dale's own signature confirms he accepted alternative consideration in exchange for relinquishing his interest. I'd want a handwriting expert to confirm the signature's authenticity before the hearing, given how much weight it's about to carry, but assuming that confirms what it appears to show, this should end Dale's partition claim entirely rather than merely delay it. Can we get that analysis done before 11 days runs out? Callum asked. I know an examiner who owes me a favor from a case a few years back, Cray said. I'll call him this afternoon. If he can turn it around in a week, we'll have time to file our response properly before the hearing, rather than walking in with evidence the judge hasn't had adequate time to consider. The week that followed felt, to Callum, considerably longer than 7 days ought to have, both of them checking the mail each morning with the particular anxious hope of people whose entire future rested on a document they couldn't hurry along, no matter how badly they wanted to. Fay continued whispering through most of that week, a habit Callum understood by then, less as fear of being overheard and more as a kind of protective quiet she'd built around herself since Wallace's death. A way of taking up as little space as possible in a world that had already taken so much from her. You don't have to whisper anymore, Callum told her gently one evening, noticing the habit again as she read aloud from one of Wallace's old letters. Whatever happens with Dale, I'm not going anywhere, and I don't think this cabin's walls are listening for anything you need to hide from them. Fay was quiet a moment, then laughed softly, the first real laugh Callum had heard from her since he'd arrived. I suppose I've been whispering since the funeral, she said at a more normal volume this time, testing the sound of her own voice like something unfamiliar. As though grief itself required quiet, and fear on top of it required even more. I hadn't fully noticed I was still doing it until you just pointed it out. Grief can have its quiet, Callum said. I just didn't want you thinking you needed to carry the fear part alone anymore. I think I stopped believing, somewhere in these past months, that anyone would actually stay long enough to hear the difference, Fay admitted. Wallace's death took the one voice in this cabin I never had to whisper around. I suppose some part of me assumed silence was simply what the place required now, without him in it. It doesn't have to be, Callum said. Not anymore. The forensic examiner's report arrived 6 days later, considerably faster than either of them had dared hope, confirming the signature's authenticity in language precise enough that even Fay, reading it herself, understood immediately that the matter was very likely settled before the hearing ever needed to happen. Dale Merrick arrived at the cabin himself, 2 days before the scheduled hearing, having been informed by his own attorney that new evidence had surfaced that considerably complicated his claim, and found Callum on the roof completing the last of the shingle repairs, an image that seemed to unsettle him more than any legal argument alone might have. I don't know who you are, Dale said, but this matter doesn't concern you. Whatever letter you found, I don't recall signing anything relinquishing my rightful interest in property my own father left to both of us equally. Your signature's being authenticated by a forensic examiner, Callum said, climbing down from the roof. Alongside your own reply letter, in your own hand, describing exactly the arrangement you and Wallace reached 14 years ago. I think that's worth reviewing honestly before this goes any further in front of a judge. I don't need a stranger telling me what's worth reviewing about my own family's business, Dale said, though something in his voice had already lost the sharp certainty it carried a moment earlier. Faye stepped out onto the porch at that moment, holding the letter itself, her voice steady despite the whisper she'd carried through most of the previous weeks. "You wrote this yourself, Dale," she said. "I recognize your handwriting from Wallace's old photo albums, the birthday cards you used to send before you two drifted apart. I don't think a forensic examiner was strictly necessary for me to know it was genuine the moment I read it." Dale's composure faltered as Faye produced the letter itself, and he read it slowly, his expression shifting from indignation to something considerably more uncertain as he recognized, evidently, both his own handwriting and a memory of an agreement he'd apparently hoped nobody would ever think to produce again. He sat down heavily on the porch steps, the letter still in his hands, saying nothing for a long moment. "I was young, and I needed the cash more than I needed a cabin I never intended to live in," Dale admitted finally. "I don't know that I've thought about this letter in over a decade. I suppose I convinced myself somewhere along the way that Wallace's death reopened a claim I'd already settled, because it was easier than admitting I simply wanted more than what I'd already agreed to take. Wallace maintained this property alone for 14 years, believing the matter was settled," Faye said. "I don't think grief entitles you to reopen an agreement your own brother trusted you to honor." "No," Dale said quietly. "I don't suppose it does." Dale withdrew his partition claim formally the following day, informing his own attorney that the newly surfaced letter made further pursuit of the matter both legally untenable and, as he put it in a brief note to Faye herself, morally indefensible given his own signature on the original agreement. The note, which Faye read aloud to Callum that evening, was brief but considerably more honest than anything Dale had offered in person. "I let grief and old resentment convince me I was owed something I'd already agreed to give up. I'm sorry for the weeks of worry I caused you, on top of everything else you've already lost this year. Wallace was a better brother to me than I was to him, in the end, and I think he'd have wanted this settled the way it's now settling, rather than the way I nearly forced it to go." Faye's ownership of the cabin and its surrounding 40 acres was confirmed without further dispute once the probate court reviewed the authenticated letter, closing the matter permanently and considerably faster than either she or Callum had expected, once Dale's own attorney recognized the futility of continuing to press a claim his client had already relinquished in writing so many years before. Foster Cray filed the final paperwork himself, waiving what remained of his usual fee once he understood the full resolution, and mentioned to Faye, on their last visit to his office, that cases resolving this cleanly were rare enough in his practice that he intended to remember this one for some time. Most partition disputes drag on for months, sometimes years, draining both sides of money neither can easily spare, he said. "I'm glad this one found its answer in a strongbox rather than a courtroom." Word of the dispute's resolution reached the nearest neighbor, a rancher named Otis Byrne, who lived 4 miles down the grade and had known Wallace Merrick casually for years, without ever quite befriending the more private Faye, and he drove over himself once he heard the story secondhand through the county grapevine that carried news along rural roads faster than any newspaper managed. "Wallace mentioned his brother to me exactly once, years back," Otis told Faye, standing at the cabin's newly repaired door. "Said Dale had a good heart underneath whatever made him leave and never look back. I'm glad to hear that heart won out in the end, even if it took a threat of losing everything to remind him of it." "I didn't know you and Wallace were close," Faye said. Not close, exactly, Otis said. Just neighborly, the way folks out this far tend to be with each other, whether they socialize regularly or not. I should have checked in on you myself these past months, rather than assuming you'd ask if you needed anything. I'm sorry for that. I don't think I'd have answered honestly if you had, Faye admitted. I wasn't in a place to ask for help from anybody until Callum showed up, whether I'd asked for it or not. Otis studied Callum a long moment, the particular appraisal of a rural neighbor deciding whether a newcomer deserved trust. Well, he said finally, seems this cabin's found itself a proper caretaker, regardless of how it happened. I'll not question good fortune too closely, whatever shape it arrives in. He stayed the better part of an hour, sharing stories of Wallace's occasional visits to town over the years, small details Faye had never heard before that filled in pieces of her husband's life beyond their own shared 6 years together, and promised, before he left, to make certain the rest of the scattered ranching community along that stretch of grade understood. The widow at the old track walker's cabin was no longer quite so alone as she'd been these past difficult months. You'll have neighbors checking in properly from now on, Otis said at the door, whether you whisper about it or not. Faye smiled at that, the particular unguarded smile of someone slowly remembering what it felt like to be looked after by more than one person at a time. Callum stayed on at the cabin through that winter, and the ones that followed, the track walker's shelter that had first given him an evening's refuge becoming, gradually and without either of them quite planning it, something closer to a shared home than either had expected to find again after the losses that had brought them each, separately, to this same remote stretch of forgotten rail line. He finished the chimney repair properly before the first hard freeze, and spent the following months restoring the rest of the cabin's smaller neglected details. A warped door frame, a window that had never quite sealed against drafts, the woodshed's roof that still needed a final coat of protective sealant. Faye began teaching him, in the evenings, the small details of Wallace's own life she found herself wanting to share now that she had someone patient enough to listen. And Callum found himself, without quite deciding to, becoming the keeper of a dead man's memory in a way that felt less like replacing him and more like honoring what he'd built. He rehung the front door properly that same winter, the one whose broken lock had let him wander in uninvited on that first cold evening, fitting it with a new latch he'd bought with his first week's wages doing odd repair work at Otis Barnes Ranch. He left the old broken lock on a shelf in the strongbox alongside Wallace's letters, a small private joke between himself and Faye about the exact mechanism that had first brought them together, one neither of them ever quite tired of mentioning on the evenings they sat by the newly repaired hearth, remembering how unlikely the whole beginning of it had actually been. Wallace would have been glad someone finally finished the roof properly, Faye told him, one evening that winter, watching snow fall past the cabin's small window, while the fire he'd built burned steady in the newly repaired hearth. He always meant to get to it himself. Some things simply wait for the right person to arrive and finish them. I think I understand now what it means to finish something somebody else started, Callum said. I spent 10 months feeling like the work my own father taught me didn't matter to anybody anymore, once a company decided a censor could do it instead. I don't feel that way anymore, sitting in this cabin. Faye reached across and took his hand, the two of them sitting quietly in the firelight, while the snow continued outside, the particular comfortable silence of two people who had each lost something significant, and found, unexpectedly, considerably more than either had thought still possible for them. Callum wrote to his father that same winter, the first letter he'd sent since the layoff, describing the cabin and the chimney and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a broken door to become, in the end, exactly the kind of home and purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the automation notice ended his career. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Callum remembered him always being. Told you a good track walker's eye for a structure's true condition would find use somewhere, whatever the railroad decided about needing it anymore. Proud of you for fixing that chimney properly, and for finding somebody worth fixing it for. Fay kept the strong box in its original spot beneath the loose floorboard, adding her own small collection of papers beside Wallace's original letters, a private record of the year that had nearly cost her everything, and had instead given her considerably more than she thought remained possible. She stopped whispering entirely by the following spring, Callum noticed, her voice settling back into the ordinary volume of a woman who no longer felt the need to make herself small in her own home, and the two of them spent that first full year together, restoring not just the cabin's physical structure, but something considerably harder to name. The particular quiet confidence of two people who had each arrived at this remote stretch of forgotten rail line carrying more loss than either had known how to speak of, and had found, in each other and in the patient work of fixing what needed fixing, exactly the kind of steady ground neither had expected to stand on again. So, here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many old agreements, made quietly between family and never written down properly enough to be remembered, get reopened the moment grief and money create an opportunity nobody expected to need defending against? And what does it take? A broken door, a hidden letter, a stranger willing to climb up and finish a roof nobody asked him to fix. For an old promise to finally hold, and for a widow who had taught herself to whisper through her own grief to finally find her voice again. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.